begin now to have a healthy debate, I hope. And my name is Tony Shannon. I'm going to be trying to chair this discussion for the next 30 minutes or so before you grab your lunch. What we're trying to talk about is health IT here at this conference, but what's close to my heart as both a clinician and somebody who's an informatician is the importance of openness in health IT, which this corner of the ground believe in. And openness is a term that we hear bandied about quite a lot more in the last year or two since the demise of the national programme. So what does openness mean? And that's what we're going to hear about today. Is four different views as to what openness means. We're going to hear from a case that it's about open source, somebody else make a case to say that it's about open standards that are key, another that actually just open data is key, and then some mention of the difference between the importance of openness and freedom and liberty to try to shepherd the way forward. So we're going to have 2 minutes from each of these guys, and then we're going to have a bit of a debate between them and open it up to questions from the audience. So, to begin, I'm going to open it up to Rowdy Rob, who's Rob Dyke, who some of you may know as being a vocal proponent of openness in NHS Health IT. And Rob is from Tactics 4, and he's going to make the case why open source is key to the future of the NHS. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Tony. So yes, my name is Rob Dyke. I work for a company, Tactics 4, and we provide professional services and support around open source products to NHS organisations. I've given a slide at a few conferences, just a little triangle on it, and at the top of the triangle it has open data, and I say that I'm not really interested in open data, sorry Aidan. Below that it has open APIs, a little wedge at the top of the triangle. Open APIs are interesting, they help you get data out of these things, so you can have open data falling out the top of this. Open APIs are interesting, they sit on top of often open standards of one kind or another, but I'm not really interested in open standards either, sorry Malcolm. I'm much more interested in a big fat baseline at the bottom of this triangle of open source, because I believe that open source allows you to create and share standards and interfaces around which people can build a variety of other sort of, tools and platforms to make things work. So the sorts of open source that I'm interested in healthcare, I'm particularly interested at the moment about a product called Wardware, which was developed at King's College Hospital. King's could have bought something off the shelf, but they chose to develop it themselves. Then they are now sort of cross-licensing and giving that code away to other trusts to be able to work with for themselves, so they can build on top of this open source base. They can collaborate in identifying components on top of this open source, which allows them to meet the needs of their organisation and share those components on that open source based product. The open source product is then freely available to trusts and to other healthcare providers. It allows them to not be beholden to any given vendor or any given platform. And I think most importantly, as a supplier of services, it keeps me on my toes, because if I mess up, then they've got some vendor independence, service provider independence, and they can move away from us at any moment in time. And I think that's very important, as Tony said in his introduction about the demise of the national programme, where essentially lots of vendors, they did a lot of good work, but they were also kind of locked in, they locked their customers into long-term contracts and didn't really have any flexibility because there was no openness in that. So I'm advocating open source over open standards and open APIs and open data. So now I'm going to pass to Malcolm, who's going to disagree with me, I hope.
Not at all, no, I fully agree with everything you said. But I think you have to bear in mind and live in, the world we live in, open source is a small patch of this exhibition. The rest of the warehouse is proprietary software. And if openness is to take off in healthcare, then we have to find a solution which the rest of this warehouse is going to pay attention to and be prepared to implement. And I can tell you now that they won't be, they probably are using open source under the bonnet, and they're not telling people. But the only way to get cooperation and interoperability between systems and deep integration between products, whether they're open source or closed source, is through open standards. What do I mean by open standards? Well, there's a great example sitting behind you, IAG. They actually use HL7, they use Oasis web standards, they use various coding systems, they use SAML. These are all technical open standards which already exist. They don't need to be developed. What they add, the value that they add is they add the profiling. They tell you how to use the open standards within a healthcare context to achieve a particular result. Now you have to get deep integration between systems, you have to be able to do that kind of deep analysis and specification work and also be prepared to invite vendors who say they're compliant to testing events called connectathons. So open standards, if you want deep integration between proprietary and open source, and even actually between open source and open source, you need to do it using open standards. The great thing about that is that the government have also recognized that, and they've just a couple of days ago came out with a policy statement supporting open standards and royalty-free open standards, I might add. So that means if you did, as a supplier, choose to comply with an open standard, there's no hidden charge, basically, somewhere down the line to either your users or to you as a developer. So open standards, to me, absolutely core if we want to make any kind of difference in healthcare.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGuire. To some extent, I'm going to have to say that I agree with Rob. I'm co-founder of Open Source Consortium version 2, and I've been a long-term advocate for open source. Equally, we sponsored an event recently at the Policy Exchange advocating open standards. So I agree with Malcolm also on the need for open standards. And the government just last week published a new definition of open standards, and not that dissimilar to the one they did in 2011, but what we need from government in the UK is that they make it mandatory. So this is a little bit like baking a cake. We need open source, but if you look at what's going on the web now, pretty much the whole of the stack is open source. So I think open source has won the argument, proprietary or under pressure. I think everyone agrees on the need for open standards, but what we need are politicians with the balls to mandate it. But neither of these things touch our citizens, and our public sectors are facing huge challenges. Their funding is being cut, but simultaneously they generate huge amounts of data about the services that we consume. And at the moment, that data is going into silos. And there is a very, very strong argument that if the public sector opens up its data, then we will have potentially much greater innovation in the delivery of our public services. And that, I think, will have a much bigger impact for the citizens on the ground. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Simon Phipps, and I'm the president of the Open Source Initiative. We set the standard for what open source actually means. So you'd expect me to be solidly behind open source as the sole factor that matters, but actually I think all three of these guys are partly wrong. The deal here is not that open source or open standards or open data are the key. What's actually key is your flexibility and your control over your own destiny. And in order to have that flexibility and control, you need to have a set of liberties which are inalienable. And those liberties need applying in each of these three areas: in the area of the source code that you're dealing with, in the area of the interoperability of that source code with other people's software, and in the area of owning your own data and being able to develop it long term. The key to you being able to control your budget, to decide who you employ, to decide what systems you deploy, to decide if and when you migrate to new systems, to decide how you integrate new systems, is to have the freedom to use the software that you have for any purpose, to have access to the source code so that any expert that you wish to have working on it can work on it, to be able to modify it, and consequently with that to have the control over it not being modified, and to be able to pass it to any part of your ecosystem. Each of those 4 freedoms then gets projected onto the subject of standards or source or data. And it's crucial that you realize that those 4 freedoms to use, study, modify and distribute your software and your data lie at the core of being a flexible, budget-conscious budget holder in this decade. Now, OSI has standardized which licenses you're going to use for open source. We actually made a statement in 2005 about open standards, a thing called the OSI Open Standards Requirement, which it turns out was what the UK government just mandated last week, was what we specified in 2005. We haven't got around to specifying an open data requirement because we've discovered that at the moment people can't actually define what open data means. But I think that as soon as that happens, we will do that. In each case, we're projecting those liberties onto the topic, and you need to do that too. You need to project the liberties onto your needs, and then make sure your suppliers are serving you rather than the other way around.
Thank you, Simon. And just before we open up to questions, I might go back to Simon to ask about making it clear the distinction in, when you say freedom, between free speech and free beer, because that can confuse the vote.
So that's why I tend to say liberty rather than freedom. The word free has crippled us for a decade in open source by making us think that it's about price. Open source isn't about price. Open source is about flexibility. It's about being in control of your own destiny, your budget, your IT system. That's what open source is about.
Thank you. Okay, we'll open the floor up to questions.
I just wanted to sort of put a word in for people who want to make money out of software. Is there anything wrong in that? I mean,
so all open source software is about is people synchronizing overlapping areas of their interests. Everybody, pretty much, who engages in open source has got an extrinsic interest that makes them engage in the community. It's not because they think it's fascinating, it's because they're making money from it. Or it may be because they're involved in some philanthropic organization that drives them to do it and is paying their salary. But every single person that I've met who is contributing significantly to open source is there because somebody is paying them. And so if you don't, somebody else is.
fair enough.
Is the behind all of these open standards, data, source, etc., I can see that there's a kind of convergence on value. I think that all these ideas are there as a business. It's considered to be that I think that's value. If you're a total cost of ownership across the whole product life cycle. So obviously you want to have it free to change your code or get other people to use it, because that's more cost effective than getting other people to do that, or buying a proprietary solution. Are there some underlying principles which go beyond value? Are there some things about this which is more important than getting the best value for value? In other words, even if the enterprise ended up costing a bit more, it would still be worthwhile doing it in an open way rather than through proprietary.
So ultimately, value is going to be the arbiter of any decision that's taken in this marketplace. One of the key things that came out of the government's open standards principles that they published last week was that they suggested that procurement processes include exit costs as well as entry costs into their valuation. And when you're looking at the value of a solution, you have to ask yourself, what is it going to cost me to move this solution on to the next generation, or to integrate this solution with other solutions in my activity? And a lot of the TCO valuations that have been made that are encouraged by proprietary vendors exclude migration away and exclude integration with. When you build those things into the costs, you discover that actually value continues to be the important aspect of open source. It doesn't cost any more as long as you're counting all the costs.
I'd add one other point to that as well, which is perhaps gets to the heart of this. in the United Kingdom, the public sector is a very, very large procurer of software. And the government and public sector bodies sometimes take the view that we're just a procurer. But actually, in fact, the public sector is a mover in the market, and it affects the market. So to answer your question, if the public sector was to look at its long-term interest, it is possible that in some cases it's in its interest to coordinate together to encourage reusable code rather than to just encourage single proprietary vendors because of the market impact that government procurement has in the UK.
Yeah, I'd just like to sort of say something about the value of interoperability as well, because not many people, when they buy a product, think about and add value to the interoperability of that product with other products that they've already got or might need in the future. Which is why you need this open standards community to force or encourage suppliers to maintain a kind of social response, corporate social responsibility towards interoperability of their products. And that's where open standards can add value, because they provide a menu basically of open standards to choose from that suppliers can implement. But it's interoperability is one of those value features which is often overlooked in procurement of proprietary products as well as open source.
Any further questions?
Do you think there's a cultural barrier within the NHS, maybe the public sector more broadly, around almost sort of preferring a brand that would be associated with proprietary software, that kind of no company, whereas the open software seems a little bit more like left field and not as aligned with the public sector, I suppose?
Would anyone like to hazard a guess as who the largest company is that contributes to open source? It's an old joke, but nobody ever got fired for buying IBM, for example. You know, they're one of the biggest contributors of open source code in the marketplace. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to the billion-dollar company that uses open source software? Red Hat. Anybody here got an Android device? Google, big company, they're behind that. Has anybody here got an Apple device? The entire Apple operating system is built on open source software. So it's not so much that big companies aren't doing open source, but you're right. I mean, we have for a long time had a culture of buying products from the likes of Microsoft and Oracle, who do a very good job of selling very big solutions through very big integrators for very big market actors like the public sector in the UK. But I think that the government is trying to encourage public sector to behave differently in the market, and is encouraging them more to look at open source for all the procurements that they put out at the moment. And I think that Francis Board and the Efficiency and Reform Group has done a lot of good work in that area over the last couple of years.
Your suppliers are all benefiting from open source themselves. The thing that really I'm advocating here is that already your suppliers all benefit from open source. They use it in their networks, they use it in their operating systems, they use open source componentry to build the solutions they sell you. It's about time you started benefiting from the same liberties that they benefited from. And so this move to open source is not about taking the brand off things, it's about exposing the liberty that those people who put the brand on things all benefit from just before they charge you a big ticket price.
Just to add that recently the Cabinet Office had a fairly large project getting data away from DirectGov, and that whole stack was built using open source, and actually they've released the code. So at the Cabinet Office, they're already embracing this different approach.
Yeah, and if you want brands, we've got more brands than you can stick at. Liferay, Mozilla, guys, Linux, whatever. Elk.
Small brand.
Oh yeah. Tech. If you like logos, yeah, there's tons of them.
Anyone else? Sorry.
I was going to just begin to close with a question asking, bearing in mind that we are here in 2012 in one corner of this emporium, and this is, I think, the second year we've had an open source Skunkworks. want to ask each of you, where do you think, in realistic terms, open source and health IT will be in about 5 years' time? For good or for bad?
I think I got the short straw. I think there are, of course, we live in a difficult economic climate at the moment, and if for the NHS to progress and to improve, I think it has to work smarter. And for it to work smarter, one of the things that it should be looking at doing is adopting more open source and being clever, boxing smarter. So I would predict, because the NHS I think actually is a wonderful organisation, then I think it will do so. I think there are already initiatives and started off, so I would expect it to be much more positive. But if we have 10% or 15% of the market in 5 years, I'll be over the moon.
So in 5 years' time, I would hope that the NHS changes the way it procures everything, basically, and makes it into a much more open process, along the lines that I was talking about earlier on, use it for software in particular. I think the needs now are so far in advance of what's available from the market that the hack day process, I think if we could get the NHS hospitals to engage in that process, to persuade its clinicians and developers and managers to engage in that process, to work out what it needs and how to get it from the market, I think I'd be over the moon.
Well, there's nothing like a good crisis to make you realise that you have to do things differently. You know, and I think, you know, our economic times mean that we do have to think, you know, much more creatively about, you know, where we spend our money and how we spend our money. I mean, you know, the NHS hasn't got that many pound notes anymore, so you need to pound notes. That's a very bad cultural reference, but pound coins. So you've got to be even more careful about where you do spend your pennies. Again, probably not the best example. I think, I mean, you know, the Skunkworks area doubled in size from last year, and if we double in size every year for the next 5 years, well, then we'll have to have 2 halls at for eHealth Insider, which is probably good for John, who sells the exhibition space. But that's what I'd like to see anyway.
So I'm not a specialist in health IT. The change that I'm expecting to come across the whole IT industry over the next 5 years is I'm expecting more of the use of open source software to be surfaced. I think that already every product you buy relies on open source. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. Whatever product you buy relies on open source. But all of the liberty that's associated with that open source is getting terminated at the supplier rather than with you. And the change that I think we're going to see increasingly over the next 5 years. By the way, 5 years isn't very long when it comes to any government-based procurement. It takes that long just to get an RFP out in some places. I think the change we will see is a gradual surfacing of those values that come from liberty. The flexibility, the control over budget, the interoperability, the exit costs being manifest. And as that transparency and that focus on liberty is more and more of a focus, which it will be if the current civil service around the Cabinet Office has anything to do with it, then we will see open source become more and more dominant. Simply because open source is the way that communities collaborate. It is inherently transparent. It is inherently flexible and empowering. And consequently, if the direction of society is towards transparency and empowerment, then that direction is also the direction towards open source.
Thank you very much, and that's a healthy, I think, and positive note which we can begin to conclude. Now, we have here a bunch of advocates for open source, but what you haven't heard is fanaticism. I hope what you've heard is a pragmatic and a positive view of the role of openness going forward in health IT. Unless there's any other questions, I'm going to ask you to join me in thanking our presenters. And to make you aware that we will have further expositions of the value of openness and open source in the NHS after lunch. Thank you very much.